This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 45 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the Serial Mormon History Podcast. Today is January 5th, 2017. Happy New Year. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Let's do a quick wrap-up of the last historical episode to kind of jump us into the timeline for this episode. The previous two episodes were discussions with Cody Nakoni discussing the possible entheogen use throughout human history and its impact on religion and possibly Mormonism. But, of course, those were the special edition episode 35 and 36. Let's discuss the last historical episode to get us through the milk of today, and then we'll just jump right into the meat. So to wrap it up, we had the Gallatin Day election battle that was basically incited by this guy, William Peniston, standing up on a barrel and talking about how those Mormons are terrible religious fanatics and whatnot. Basically, the mobs reacted and got in this huge fight, and it just anteed up the constant religious and socioeconomic strife that was just absolutely plaguing Missouri at this time. After that, in response to the Gallatin Election Day battle, Jo and Rigdon take the Danites to Diahmen to impose their will upon elected officials, Sheriff William Morgan and Justice Adam Black. The Mormon Danites surrounded them and forced them to sign these affidavits saying that they won't side with the anti-Mormons, that they will treat the Mormons fairly in legal practices. Of course, that seems reasonable to do, but it was illegal, obviously. Imposing your will with 150 armed men surrounding the homes of elected officials, yeah, you're breaking a couple laws there. So, of course, Boggs organizes a militia to answer to this Mormon aggression, and there's a just absolute chaos. And really, the main takeaway is nobody has the legal or ethical high ground, as the rhetoric was being amped up on both sides of this Mormon and Missouri conflict. So that wraps up the milk for today's episode. We got a lot to get through, so let's jump into the meat. In order to understand the focus of the timeline today, we need to be introduced to a few very important people in the Mormon-Missouri conflict here in 1838, and we need to understand where their allegiances lie throughout the conflict, because that's very important. So the first people for our introductions today are Generals Atchison and Doniphan. First, General David R. Atchison. He was living in Liberty Clay County, Missouri in 1830 when the Mormons began moving into Jackson County after declaring it Zion. In 1833, when the Mormons were chased out of Jackson County and moved up to Caldwell and Daviess County, Atchison, being friendly to the Mormons, was chosen to represent them in the quasi-legal expulsion proceedings. So that's General David R. Atchison, a friendly to the Mormon, non-Mormon, living in Missouri. Next, we have General Alexander W. Doniphan. In 1833, during the Mormon expulsion from Jackson County, Doniphan actually moved his business into the same building as General Atchison and began practicing law as well, defending the Mormons. So keep these two guys in mind for the next few episodes, as they will be very important people in our timeline throughout the rest of 1838, really. Generals Atchison and Doniphan were on the Mormon side for this whole 1838 conflict in Missouri. If not for these non-Mormon generals that sympathized with the Mormons, shit would have become exponentially worse, incomprehensibly faster than it did. So those are the two main guys for our introductions today. We'll be talking about these guys quite a bit, so as I said, keep them in mind. That's it for introductions for now. Of course, we will introduce other people as they become relevant, but let's jump into how these guys specifically are relevant to the historical timeline. In response to the Danites surrounding the homes of Justice Adam Black and Sheriff William Morgan, the sheriff of town, Morgan, issued writs of arrest for Joseph Smith and his first general, General Lyman Wight. Now remember, peaceful assembly isn't a crime, even if every person in that assembly is armed with all of the guns in the country. But according to Missouri law, crossing state lines and surrounding an elected official's home to force that official to sign a document under duress was considered a series of crimes. Crimes for which General Lyman Wight and Jo were required to answer. So on September 4th, Jo met with Generals Atchison and Doniphan and retained them as the Mormons' legal counsel, and they gave Jo some good advice. They told him and Lyman Wight to appear voluntarily at the preliminary hearing to answer for the mob-related crimes of crossing county lines and surrounding the homes of elected officials. In an act of good faith and in hopes of some kind of de-escalation, Jo and Wight consented. With a caveat, of course. The district judge that would preside over the hearing was Justice Adam Black, one of the peoples against whom the Mormons had committed the crimes. There can be no argument made that Black was an objective justice of the peace in this preliminary trial, and everybody knew it. So, the caveat was, Jo requested that Black be replaced by another local justice who wasn't involved with the mob crimes that Jo and Wight had committed. Here enters Justice Austin A. King. So Judge Black and Judge King, those are the two different judges we're working with today. Judge Black would be viciously opposed to the Mormons throughout the entire conflict. They surrounded his house, I don't blame him. He would be one of the primary instigators of aggression against the Mormons during the final months of 1838. But Judge King, who was put in his place for this preliminary hearing, also wasn't exactly an unaffected observer of the conflict. Now here's a quick description of Judge King from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, a book I've been relying heavily on to properly hash out this confusing time in Mormon history. And I'll just say it right now, please read this book. It's available digitally or paperback online, or you can go to Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City and buy a copy like I did. I always recommend, of course, supporting a small business if at all possible. Please read this book to understand what we're discussing right now. It offers an immense amount of perspective that I could never convey in a podcast. So this is a description, and it's quoting Peter H. Burnett, who was a contemporary and a local attorney. Judge Austin King was, quote, a very serious religious man, not generally given to joviality, but respected for his legal knowledge and conduct of court. Judge King was fully aware of the history of Mormon problems in Missouri. His brother-in-law had been killed 5 years previously in a skirmish with the Mormons in Jackson County. How this affected King's view of the Mormons and his judgment at the hearing cannot be determined. End quote. So personally, I would go out on a limb and say that Judge King probably didn't like the Mormons, as did most non-Mormon Missourians. They didn't like them, or they feared the Mormons and the Danites. But at least Judge King's house hadn't been surrounded by the armed Danites, as had Judge Black. So Judge King was somewhat more objective in this hearing than Judge Black, and was therefore appointed to preside over this hearing. The argument could be made that the Mormons' legal counsel should have persisted in finding a judge who was further disconnected from the events dealing with the Mormons than Judge King. But really, given the nature of this, just a preliminary hearing and the lack of proper legal infrastructure in the state, King was about the best the Mormons could do. So the court hearing for Jo and Wight on September 7th, 1838, was merely a preliminary trial. It was only held to determine if the prosecution had enough evidence to pursue a real trial, a grand jury trial. This distinction of preliminary trials as opposed to actual criminal court hearings is a very important detail to remember over the next few weeks, as it will come into play in November of 1838. So the preliminary hearing wasn't held in any large courthouse as would be expected. Rather, it was a little more of kind of like a ragtag of a hearing held in a grove of trees on a farm owned by a man named John Raglan. Now, as would be expected with any high-tension case like this, mobs from both sides of the aisle showed up in force to express their stance on the perceived Mormon aggression. Perceived aggression is important because both sides felt as if they were operating on the defensive when both sides had been taking steps that were seen as aggressive by the other side. So this is another quote from the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri, and it's describing the situation as this September 7th preliminary trial overseen by Austin King proceeded. Quote, "A dozen Mormons, together with Atchison and Doniphan, our two non-Mormon friendly Mormon lawyers and generals, accompanied Smith and Wight to the hearing. Despite Atchison's assurances, the prophet still feared for his safety. He stationed a company of armed men just inside the Caldwell border with orders to ride swiftly to the rescue if violence occurred. The Far West militia also stood ready to give assistance, and as one further precaution, Joseph and Hiram Smith hid their weapons nearby in the woods. As the time neared for the hearing to begin, a large and unfriendly crowd of Daviess settlers gathered at Raglan's farm, cursing and threatening the Mormon defendants. Before trouble could begin, General David Atchison stepped forward and, fingering his gun, warned the men, quote, "Hold on, boys. If you fire the first gun, there will not be one of you left," end quote. General Atchison, being friends with the Mormons and a respected non-Mormon citizen, was heard and, duly noted by the opposing mobs. No violence would ensue this evening, and the court proceeded without incident. But of course, William Peniston, that was the dickbag who stood on the barrel and incited the riot during the Gallatin election day, that was a month prior to what we're talking about now. He was the prosecutor on behalf of the state of Missouri for this hearing, with Justice Adam Black appearing as the prosecution's only witness for this preliminary hearing. Now, the point of this hearing was more ceremonial than anything else. The entire reason for calling it in the first place was to determine whether or not Jo and General Lyman Wight were in the wrong for surrounding the homes of elected officials, and, of course, to try and ascertain the motives of the Danites in taking such actions. Essentially, if Peniston and Black could prove that the Mormons had malicious intent and were going to kill Adam Black if he didn't sign the Mormons' document, it would be treasonous and fitting for capital punishment for Jo and Wight. But it was still a great burden of proof to meet in order to legally call for capital punishment in a treason case. If you're going to get somebody convicted of treason, deserving of capital punishment, you have a lot of evidence that you need to bring to the table to substantiate that case. But of course, Jo and his witnesses contended that the visit of the mob outside of Justice Black and Sheriff Morgan's homes was merely a cordial visit with an armed mob. I don't know how you make that argument, but it was completely their decision to sign or reject the document. The Mormons only wanted it signed to allay the collective anxiety of the Mormons who feared that they had no allies in elected office. And they weren't far from wrong at this point. No violence had happened to Black or Morgan, so Jo and Wight had a pretty solid case, right? Because this was only a preliminary trial, however, the only reason for holding it was to determine if the prosecution had enough evidence to move forward to a grand jury trial and bear further investigation. Justice King determined the prosecution's case was solid enough to warrant a grand jury to investigate charges of misdemeanor conduct on the part of Jo and Wight. Now, of course, treason is a felony, but the misdemeanor conduct that they're speaking of is marching across county lines with an armed mob. Now, this preliminary trial was seen as completely unfair by the Mormons and even by some local newspapers. The general feeling was that King had sided with the anti-Mormon mob and only came down with the verdict to hold a grand jury trial because he disliked the Mormons. Another justification for King's decision was to hopefully cool off the tensions existing between the Mormons and Missourians. I mean, think about it. If Judge King had sided with the Mormons and found no fault, the anti-Mormon mob surrounding this, essentially this tribunal on this guy's farm would have reacted, right? They might just drag Jo and Wight out by the heels and have their own tribunal ending with a lynching of these largely innocent men. You know, a small number of good arguments can be made that King took the right side of the conflict and he made the right decision. Now, to lend credibility to such claims, Jo and General Wight submitted to the verdict without protest, probably as a sign of good faith that they would obey the legal proceedings regardless of Judge King's biases. Now, it's easy to look back on this year and a half from June to November of 1838 and say that nobody took any action to try and de-escalate the situation. I think I've said that in the past, but that's not entirely true. This was one moment we can point to Jo and the leadership and admire their resolve to submit to legal proceedings and obey the law. This was a very good move. The simple act of Jo and Wight showing up voluntarily at this hearing and not needing to be arrested is evidence that they were trying to do whatever was best for the Mormons, and at some points they were trying to de-escalate the situation, even if it was at the expense of their public persona. But they weren't stupid. They didn't know what to expect that night. The anti-Mormon mob wanted Jo and Wight to answer for their crimes of treason, and the American frontier was often operating under kind of a Jacksonian majority-rule democracy, which really it allowed a little bit of wiggle room in the lynching department. The Missourian vigilante mob knew that Jo and Wight surrounded Judge Black and Sheriff Morgan's homes to force Mormon sympathy, which they despised. They wanted justice, or retribution, depending on how you look at it, right? If Judge King simply let Jo and Wight go, who knows how the mob would react? They may just throw a rope over a tree branch, take care of the whole Mormon problem right then and there. Fear of unjust vigilante violence is exactly why Jo had a band of Danites camped out a few miles away and a panic squad of a dozen Mormon men surrounding him. That's why Jo hid their guns in the forest nearby for safety. If shit went tits up, they were prepared for the worst. So let's quickly go over some of the hidden variables that were adding fire to this conflict. You know, we can trace most of the social pressures between the Mormons and the anti-Mormons to land disputes. We've been over this before, so I'll be brief. The Mormons were buying up land all over Missouri because they believed that's where Zion was, and the U.S. government gave them great incentives to settle the untamed land. In many frontier states, if you moved to an area and improved it, the land was yours after a few years. That, or the government would offer stimulus packages that made the land absurdly cheap just to get people to settle the areas. Of course, there was the religious aspect, which played no small part. Most of the people that were opposed to the Mormons were devoutly religious people that didn't want to see a Mormon theocracy develop, much less in their own backyard. Picture how many religious people today are afraid of an Islamic caliphate rising on American soil or something. I mean, it's a truly hysterical phobia with no foundation in reality. I mean, the odds are so absurdly low that such a thing could happen. But fear-mongering doesn't work by actual numbers and statistics. The Missourians felt the same way about the Mormons, but they had a bit of Mormon history to substantiate those fears, making those fears far more rational than anything we can empathize with today. Now add into the mix the fact that the Mormons would vote in whatever way would serve their interests best, as is the greatest ideal of any democracy. That did mean, however, that they would unequivocally oppose the Missourian vote, and we saw those tensions play out with the Gallatin Election Day battle on August 6th in the last episode. Now, one small piece of this puzzle was the fact that Mormons were, for the most part, abolitionists from the liberal northern states. or at least they weren't friendly to slavery, while Missouri was the northernmost slave state in the Union in the 1830s. The Mormons were passing out pamphlets and flyers to freed slaves with advertisements that they would teach them how to read the Book of Mormon. All that was necessary for a real slave uprising was for some freed slaves to become literate and have one powerful, charismatic leader to fall in line behind. Like Jo. Now, this was an intense fear that gripped the Missourians. Even though there was little evidence that the Mormons collectively were abolitionists, for most of Jo's writings, it sounds like he was more of a states' rights kind of guy, which was what most of the Missourians liked. That Jacksonian frontier outlaw-style Democrat Party. And of course, another pressure, the Kirtland Safety Society Company. It deserves a spot at the table, and thanks to Jackson's Specie Circular, the Panic of 1837 had wrought the world's greatest depression on the New and Old World alike. The Mormons had been using paper money that was made more valuable if it was used as kindling or to wipe your ass, and now they were in dire straits trying to recoup their losses. Now enters one more piece of the puzzle that adds to the pressure of Mormons versus Missourians. The rumors that were spreading were damning at many levels. Rumors of hundreds killed at the Gallatin election battle and of the Danite mobs surrounding the homes of public officials were proliferating and used as justification for anti-Mormon vigilantes to do whatever they pleased. But the problem was these rumors, and when rumors circulate, they quickly change public opinion, whether or not they're founded in reality. So this extra piece that I'm talking about was founded on nothing but rumors, from what the evidence tells us anyway. Missouri was the frontier bordering the land of the Lamanites, or as everybody but Mormons called them, the Indians. The Indian Removal Act had pushed the native population across the Missouri River and temporarily allowed them to settle in the border towns. One of these border towns was Kaw, Missouri, just outside of Independence, where the Cowdrey Missionary Troop first visited after settling in Independence back in late 1830. The Mormon missionaries were proselyting to the natives and were kicked off the reservations because they didn't have permits to preach Christianity over there. Jo even commanded his closest counselors in 1831 to take the native women as wives, the way the prophets of old took multiple wives. I mean, that's paraphrasing, of course, but that's Joseph's first polygamy doctrine revelation. The Mormons were fairly friendly to the Native Americans, but from all available evidence, the natives couldn't have given a shit about Jo and his magic gold Bible. It was just another crazy Christian sect that was coming and trying to preach to the natives. Now, this is taken from the title page of the 1830 Book of Mormon. I'm reading it from the josephsmithpapers.org, which has a PDF of a first edition Book of Mormon with its pedigree intact. There's going to be a link for it in the show notes, but this is one reason why I love the Joseph Smith Papers project. The information they do make available is rock solid scholarship produced by the church itself. You can trust the shit out of these sources. This is an original 1830 Book of Mormon. Quote, Book of Mormon, an account written by the hand of Mormon upon the plates taken from the plates of Nephi. Wherefore, it is an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi, and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites, which are a remnant of the house of Israel, and also to Jew and Gentile, written by way of commandment, and also by the spirit of prophecy and revelation, end quote. Now, you may wonder what that title page has to do with anything, or why I prefaced reading that preface with talk of damaging rumors that were circulating throughout 1838. Well, rumors began circulating that Mormons were trying to strike allegiances with the Native American population, which remained on the other side of the Missouri River. Collusion for the purposes of overthrowing the Missouri government and establishing their own Mormon theocracy. There's apparently no historical foundation for these rumors, but it's not a hard conclusion to reach, especially if you hate the Mormons and are willing to join the vigilantes to fight the Mormon devils. I mean, the fucking Book of Mormon, the foundational text of the religion, states on its title page that it's written to the Lamanites primarily and to Jew and Gentile secondarily. Join that with the fact that the missionaries had been proselyting to the natives occasionally and were in the process of establishing their theocratic kingdom in far western Diahmen, not very far from the native settlements. It's easy to believe that the Mormons would turn to the natives for help in fighting the Missourian mobs, regardless of whether they were based on rumor or fact. Unfortunately for us all, it's much easier to spread a rumor than it is to dispel a rumor. Now, whether or not the Mormons were actually allied with the natives, anti-Mormons were convinced they were, and that's what matters. Remember back to the Grandison Newell lawsuit of 1836? He claimed that Jo commanded 2 Mormons to wait outside of his house to kill him. Whether or not Jo actually commanded that to happen, it makes a greater impact that rumors were spreading claiming he did. The same was the case with the rumors concerning Mormon allegiances with the Native Americans. Facts didn't seem to matter when the Mormons could be dehumanized by spreading these rumors. In order to dispel such cancerous rumors, Jo and Rigdon released a statement published in the Niles National Register October 13, 1838. The affidavit was signed on September 8th. Quote, "We hereby certify that we have learned that a Mr. Nathan Marsh has certified that the people sometimes called Mormons have ingratiated themselves with the Indians for the purpose of getting the Indians to commit depredations upon the people of this state, which certificate of march, as represented to us, is utterly false. We have never had any communications with the Indians on any subject," that's a lie, "and we and all the Mormon Church, as we believe, entertain the same feelings and fears towards the Indians that are entertained by other citizens of this state. We are friendly to the Constitution and laws of this state and of the United States and wish to see them enforced." End quote. A man named Colonel Price, who had been spreading these rumors, considered this affidavit convincing enough, and he personally sought to dispel the rumors that he'd been spreading for a month and a half prior to this. He wrote a letter that's currently in the U.S. archives dated September 8th, stating, quote, "There was nothing thought about raising the Indians, about enlisting the Negroes, or about abolitionism." End quote. That was taken from page 85 of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. So this is what the historical record shows us. There's simply no evidence existing that Jo or any Mormon representatives were attempting to ally themselves with freed slaves or the Native Americans to overcome the vigilante violence they were dealing with. That's what the current record shows us, and barring some amazing document revelation, it seems reliable, and every legitimate historian would agree with that perspective. Now, I'm going to speculate on the record. And that's all this is. This is my naked opinion. You decide for yourself what makes sense. In my opinion, why the fuck wouldn't Jo try everything in his power to overcome the mob violence? Now, I see this whole time in history as the church being run by a two-faced Joseph Smith. There was the public Joseph Smith that submitted to the preliminary trial without violence on September 7th, and then released these public statements with demonstrable falsehoods to try and reduce the mob violence or relinquish the rumors that were gripping the public mind. But on the other hand, we have the Jo who was the commander-in-chief of the Danites, an army of Israel, who preaches from the pulpit that he refuses to be subject to depredations by the Missourians and won't submit to mobocrats. Jo and Lyman Wight had been quoted many times saying that they won't agree to a law that refuses to protect the Mormons, which is a reasonable claim. But this is the two-faced Joseph I'm talking about here. This public statement said that, quote, "We have never had any communication with the Indians on any subject," end quote. That's simply a lie. The Mormons had plenty of contact with Native Americans trying to convert them to Mormonism. They weren't successful, despite the reports of Ollie claiming otherwise, but they were trying to bring the natives into the Mormon fold. Given the strong wording of the affidavit signed by Jo and Rigdon, this perfectly illustrates the prophet and his closest counselor saying one thing with the complete opposite being the truth. My opinion, Jo and his Mormons were desperate. I think it's absurd to claim that the idea of allying with the natives wasn't in the mind of Jo or Rigdon. What historical document would we expect to find if Jo were trying to strike up these diplomatic relations? None. That's the problem. If Jo himself or one of his minions went to the natives asking for help in fighting the Missourians, there wouldn't be any surviving documentation of it. There's simply no way to prove that it did or didn't happen. We can just say that there is no evidence showing us for sure that they did try to strike a military or diplomatic tie with the natives. We just have evidence of Jo and Rigdon unequivocally denying it in a public statement that contained a blatant falsehood. I personally believe that Jo, at very least, had the idea in his mind, and very possibly tried to combine forces for the sake of overthrowing the Missouri government. I also believe that Jo commanded Daviess and that other guy to go kill Grandison Newell back in 1836, even though that was a lawsuit based on just rumors. And I guess it's a matter of how we interpret the historical record in this case. Oftentimes, powerful rumors that are acted upon by mobs have some foundation in reality, but are just blown out of proportion. So that's my naked opinion. You, the listener, you consider the facts for yourself and come to your own conclusions. My opinions and biases are transparent, and hopefully you aren't too influenced by my limitations or liberations as a non-historian podcaster. Now, to bring this up to a bigger point, unfortunately any actions taken by Jo, Rigdon, or really any person in a position of authority to dispel rumors didn't really help much. Violence continued to escalate. After the September 7th hearing, rumors spread that the Mormons were 1,500 to 2,000 strong, eminently expecting reinforcements from Canada and in open rebellion of the government affecting their will by Danite force. Now, there were around 2,000 Mormons in Diahmen at this time, but that was the whole population. Only a small percentage of that 2,000 people actually would fight, but with rumors circulating throwing around 2,000 armed men, facts don't simply matter. That's the damaging impact of rumors like this. So vigilante mobs began to swarm Mormons living on the outskirts of Mormon settlements in Daviess, Carroll, and Caldwell counties. This is a quote from an affidavit by Asael Lathrop, who was a faithful Mormon living in Missouri. The entire affidavit is available on Lathrop's Wikipedia page, which is in the show notes here. Quote, I settled in Missouri in the summer of 1838, in Caldwell County, where I purchased land and erected buildings. The said land I now have a deed of, and in the fall, I purchased a claim on what is called the East Fork of Grand River, together with a large stock of cattle and horses, sheep, and hogs, it being some 60 miles from the aforesaid county where I first located, and moved on to the latter place, supposing that I was at peace with all men. But I found by sad experience that I was surrounded by enemies. For in the fall of 1838, whilst at the home of my family, I was notified by a man by the name of James Weldon that the people of Livingston County had met at the house of one Dr. William P. Thompson, then living in the attached part of said county, for the purpose of entering into measures respecting the people called Mormons. And the same Weldon was a member of the same. And also the aforesaid William P. Thompson was a justice of the peace, and they all jointly agreed to drive every Mormon from the state, and notified me that I must leave immediately, or I would be in danger of losing my life. All this time some of my family were sick, but after listening to the entreaties of my wife to flee for safety, I committed them into the hands of God and left them. It being on Monday morning, and in a short time after I left, there came some 10 or 15 men to my house, and took possession of the same, and compelled my wife to cook for them, and also made free to take such things as they saw fit. And whilst in this situation, my child died, which I have no reason to doubt was for the want of care, which, owing to the abuse she received and being deprived of rendering that care she would had she been otherwise situated. My boy was buried by the mob, my wife not being able to pay the last respects to her child. I went from my home into Daviess County and applied to Austin A. King and General Atchison for advice, as they were acting officers in the state of Missouri. There were men called out to go and liberate my family, which I had been absent from some 10 or 15 days, and on my return, I found the remainder of my family confined to their beds, not being able the one to assist the other, and my house guarded by an armed force. I was compelled to remove my family in this situation on a bed to a place of safety. This, together with all the trouble and for the want of care, was the cause of the death of the residue of my family, as I have no doubt, which consisted of a wife and 2 more children, as they died a few days after the arrival at my friends. Such was my situation, that I was obliged to assist in making their coffins." End quote. This man, Asahel Lathrop, being chased out of his home and his whole family dying of exposure and sickness, essentially, was by no means an isolated incident. Anti-Mormon vigilantes, without government sanction, harassed the Mormons and chased them from their homes, just as they had this Asahel Lathrop guy. Now, this is approaching October in Missouri. There were some cold nights, and some people just died from exposure and starvation. In response to this violence being perpetrated against the Mormons, Jo and his closest leaders ramped their shit up to 11. Jo and Rigdon's rhetoric escalated at the same rate the violence against innocent Mormons living outside Far West and Diahmen had risen. General Lyman Wight, somebody who'd been by Jo's side during the 1834 March of Zion's camp and long before, is an important piece to the Mormon puzzle. There's a great description of Lyman Wight on page 86 of 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. Quote, "Impetuous, bold, and fiercely loyal to Joseph Smith, Wight personified the growing militant spirit in Mormonism. He had no love for the Missouri people, who had driven him from his homes in Jackson and Clay counties, and he regularly denounced them from the pulpit. William Swartzel reported that Wight, in a sermon, referred to his Missouri neighbors as hypocrites, long-faced dupes, devils, infernal hobgoblins, and ghosts who ought to be damned and sent to hell where they properly belonged." Further quoting Swartzel, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." Wight, who held the rank of colonel in the state militia, rode a large brown horse with a bear skin on the saddle. He wore a red scarf tied around his head Indian style, had his shirt open and sleeves rolled up, and carried a large cutlass and guns by his side, his rough demeanor and cool leadership infusing his troops with confidence." End quote. So General Lyman Wight significantly contributed to the problem. He was spouting Rigdon's July 4th oration-level rhetoric from the pulpit, effectively vilifying the Missourians, dehumanizing them, and swaying the Mormon public opinion that they were alone, and no Missourian could be relied upon for help. So the Mormons matched the Missourian vigilantes in all levels of escalation. In response to the anti-Mormon mobs chasing Mormons out of their homes in Caldwell, Daviess, and Carroll counties, and the surrounding outerlying areas, the Mormons fortified Diahmen and Far West as the twin sanctuaries for the Mormons, and the Danites began running mobile patrols. Now, one of these mobile patrols learned of a small convoy of arms, which was being transported through Caldwell County to the militia in Daviess County, where Diahmen is located. Now, Jo and Wight, of course, were scared of what might happen when these arms reached their intended destination, so they stopped that from happening. On September 9th, 2 days after this court hearing by Judge King held on this guy Ragland's farm, the convoy made up of a couple of wagons transported by 3 men who were named William McCaney, Allen Miller, and John B. Comer, was liberated or appropriated or stolen, whatever you want to call it, by a Mormon mob. Altogether, 45 guns were taken by the Mormon mob and absorbed into the army of Israel. Those were 45 guns that had been sanctioned for the militia in Daviess County, issued by the Richmond County Government Armory for the Daviess militia to defend itself. The Mormon mob overran them and took the 3 men prisoner. This was a terrible move. This act of the Mormons attacking a convoy and seizing 45 guns served to do a number of things, and different people took it different ways. And once again, rumors fucked everything up. It made it so much worse. Now try to picture yourself in each different social position given what just happened, alright? If you're a Mormon and you hear about this escalation in violence and the army of Israel appropriating these arms for themselves, it may be perceived in a positive light. I mean, right, you may think for a moment, hey, we're getting chased out of our homes, but at least the prophet and the Danites are taking care of the problem and securing the Twin Cities for safe living for all Mormons. Then, of course, the thought may occur, what happens when the militia back in Richmond County hears about Mormons stealing their guns? What then? I mean, will they march on far west where the guns went and take the arms back one way or another? I mean, this may have been a small victory for the Mormons, but it was a terrible move, strategically speaking. Now picture yourself as a Missourian living in Daviess or Caldwell County with a vehement hatred for those religious fanatics known as the Mormonites. These people who've been spewing warlike rhetoric from the pulpit for months, threatening a war of extermination. You've been hearing rumors of hundreds killed in various scuffles between the Mormons and your fellow Missourians, none of which you can verify as true. Then you hear about the Mormons seizing a convoy of government weapons and taking prisoners? What happens now? Can you count on the Mormons not using those weapons to drive you out of your home the way the militias have been driving the Mormons out of their homes? Now picture yourself as Generals Atchison or Doniphan. I mean, you've aligned yourself with the Mormons, but you're also respected lawyers and citizens employed by the Missourian government to head up sanctioned militias to combat and de-escalate the violence with the Mormons. You hear of them taking these arms and men as prisoners, an act of treason, and what do you do in response? What if you're Governor Lilburn Boggs, and it's your task to quell this Mormon rebellion and put the unrest to rest? What do you do? I mean, there's no high ground here. The argument can be made, and it was many times by many people, that the Mormons were only acting out of self-preservation, defensively, as they called it, and Generals Doniphan and Atchison knew it, and agreed that was the case. That's why they agreed to defend the Mormons. All the while this was going on in Daviess County, an army of 150 men, led by Dr. W. Austin, was in the middle of marching to DeWitt in Carroll County to remove the Mormons from DeWitt one way or another. Now, DeWitt was a contentious town since the Mormon refugees began moving there in the previous spring. By early September, there were dozens of Mormon families living in DeWitt, and the anti-Mormons didn't want them there. The original settlers from decades before were afraid that DeWitt might become the next Far West or Diahmen or something, and it was also a strategic bottleneck north of Independence on the Missouri River. Such fears were founded as the Mormons were moving into DeWitt nearly as fast as they were moving into Diahmen and Far West. What else could the locals presume other than the worst? Now, once the militia headed by Dr. W. Austin caught word that the Mormons had stolen 45 guns and taken 3 men as prisoner, they halted their march for DeWitt, turned around and marched straight for Diahmen to flex their muscles. Mormons and Missourians both sent petitions to Judge King asking for militia intervention to protect both sides of the conflict. Judge King dispatched General Atchison to get his ass out to Diahmen as fast as he could to sort out all the confusion. Now, this is the phrasing of the actual letter, to, quote, dispel the forces in Daviess and all the assembled armed forces in Caldwell, and while there, cause those Mormons who refuse to give up to surrender and be recognized, for it will not do to compromise the law with them, end quote. In response, Atchison immediately called out 400 armed men as a sanctioned militia force to respond to the Mormons' defensiveness and the active aggressiveness of Dr. W. Austin's militia, who were headed to Diahmen as well. Tension was building as multiple different militias began converging upon the focal point of Diahmen in Daviess County. By September 14th, Dr. W. Austin's anti-Mormon mob had camped out less than 5 miles from Diahmen, and the Mormons had fortified the town with timber and wagons all around. Every entrance and exit to the town was barricaded and under constant control by members of the Danites. There were about 400 to 500 armed Mormon troops camped out at Diahmen, prepared for a fight, including General Lyman Wight, who was the commanding officer of the Mormons. Now, General Doniphan, the other general who was friendly to the Mormons, and his small contingency of troops had just been in Far West, where he was able to negotiate directly with Jo the release of the 45 guns and the prisoners, when he received word of Dr. W. Austin's troops actively sieging Diahmen. He made an immediate 37-mile march with his men in one day to get to Diahmen, just trying to calm everything down. Now remember, Generals Atchison and Doniphan were friendly to the Mormons and had been Jo and Wight's legal counsel during the preliminary trial the week previous. Both of these generals were marching with their troops to Diahmen, while Dr. Austin's troops were camped out on the outskirts of Diahmen, while the Mormons were inside Diahmen fortifying the shit out of it. Daviess County was a brewing perfect shitstorm here. Doniphan and his troops arrived late evening on September 14th, literally just as the Mormons and Austin's troops were preparing for battle the next day. General Doniphan, being the badass that he was, literally camped with his troops in the middle ground, no man's land, between Austin's vigilante mob and the Mormons holding up inside Diahmen. Now, General Doniphan serving as a barrier had a few profound effects. The anti-Mormons couldn't march on the Mormons in Diahmen if there was a state militia between them that wouldn't allow fighting. Nor could the Mormons leave their fortification with superior numbers to brute force a victory against Austin's troops. Doniphan effectively turned his militia into a flesh curtain between these two viciously opposed armies. But another profound thing that happened at this time, and it was a horrifying realization on everybody's part. Doniphan's troops were made up largely of people that hated the Mormons too. Even though they had orders to stop violence from happening by any means necessary, if fighting broke out, Doniphan's troops probably wouldn't side with the Mormons in the conflict. It would be perfectly expected for them to defect and join Austin's anti-Mormon vigilantes. The only difference between Austin's and Doniphan's armies was who they were led by, a sentiment not lost on Doniphan's troops. If a match struck the kindling that had been built up with all these separate armies, there wouldn't be anything stopping Doniphan's troops from committing mutiny of their commander and siding with Austin's troops in a full-blown assault on Diahmen. That was a constant problem with the people who comprised the state-sanctioned militias who usually hated the Mormons. They were expected to keep the peace and follow the orders of their commanding officers, but if a massive battle broke out and all order and commands went out the window, most of Doniphan's troops may very well just ignore a cease and desist order and continue fighting until all the Mormons were dead. So suddenly you have Austin's troops of 150 people opposing the 500 troops of Mormons in Diahmen, and then Doniphan's 400 troops camp out in between the two armies. Suddenly, if those two armies combined, there's a superior force that's sieging Diahmen. It's just too tense to possibly describe. So on September 18th, after this all went down, Governor Lilburn Boggs received word of the standoff between the multiple militias, and he organized a militia of 2,800 troops in Richmond, set to march out immediately upon organization. Now, of course, state-sanctioned militias were the only armed forces a governor or any elected official could call upon to fight Jo's mob of armed zealots. There wasn't a National Guard or any full-timed armed forces commissioned to handle these situations. That infrastructure wouldn't exist for another half of a century at least, probably longer. What this meant in practical applications was that state-sanctioned militias were comprised of citizen soldiers who carried their personal biases and hatred into the fight. One of the main uses of the National Guard today is to bring in soldiers who are disconnected from any given situation for the purpose of restoring order. Having a third-party military force to calm the situation down simply wasn't a luxury that Boggs, Atchison, or Doniphan had access to. They could only call out state-sanctioned militias comprised of citizen soldiers from Missouri. The result of this lack of strategic coordination and existing infrastructure was a situation that made Governor Lilburn Boggs look like a damn fool. On September 18th, he called the 2,800 men together to form the militia, working on information he'd received 1 to 2 days prior. Of course, it takes a few days to gather that many men into platoons, organize leadership, and arm every one of the nearly 3,000 people. By the time the army was ready to march to Diahmen to assist Generals Atchison and Doniphan, Boggs received word that the tension had been dispelled by Doniphan, and he was forced to disband the gathering army in Richmond County. This was not the first or the last time this would happen during the conflict, and each time it happened successively, the media had more fun lampooning Boggs, effectively demolishing his political career in the process. One report that I read out of the 1838 Mormon War in Missouri said that calling and disbanding so many troops cost the state upwards of $60,000 before the conflict was resolved. Now that's over $1 million of today's dollars spent on gathering and arming troops, only to blueball everybody and send them all home a few days later. This was also in September, during harvest season. Most of these militiamen were smiths, tanners, shop owners, or farmers, pulled away from their daily work to gather from surrounding counties to formulate this militia, losing many days' worth of labor during harvest season in the process. That $60,000 number was only cost to the state. It says nothing of the larger economic impact of the tens of thousands of lost man-hours by the 2,800 people that couldn't work their fields for days during this confusing militia time. Of course, this only infuriated Boggs, making him want to disconnect himself from the whole Mormon situation because it was a non-win proposition. For many people like Boggs, dealing with anything Mormon in Missouri was nuclear radiation to their career. Generals Doniphan and Atchison, while friendly to the Mormons, by the end of the conflict, they were calling the Mormons fanatics who needed to be dealt with, putting them in a more positive light for those who hated the Mormons. But Boggs couldn't seem to get anything right, and his own apathy played a large role in the escalating conflict. By the time early October rolls around, Doniphan and Atchison are both writing to Boggs informing him of escalating tensions and pleading with him to make a personal appearance to quell this conflict. Every petition for his presence was refused. Boggs wasn't responsible for the conflict, but he was responsible for not doing everything in his power to stop it from getting worse. By late October, he'd issued the infamous Mormon extermination order to hopefully deal with the situation once and for all. But that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's get back to the end of September and see how things played into the beginning of October. An agreement was made between the Missourians and the Mormons living in Daviess County. On September 26th, they had a meeting to appraise the value of the non-Mormons' land and come to an agreement that the Mormons would buy out all of the non-Mormon citizens living in Daviess County, essentially concentrating the Mormon numbers and opening up a bunch of property for the endless stream of refugees arriving from Ohio and Canada and, well, DeWitt from being chased out of there. It was generally understood by both parties that if an agreement couldn't be made, the Mormons would be driven out by the militias with violent measures. But luckily for all, an agreement was struck, and the few remaining non-Mormons vacated Daviess County, selling their property to the Mormons. But this was a double-edged sword. This agreement was perceived as a godsend by the Mormons, and the Missourians who'd been living in Daviess County for decades longer than any Mormons felt like their home turf had just been uprooted by the strike of a pen. But given the escalating conflict, most non-Mormons had run from Daviess County like their hair was on fire by this point. But the few remaining holdouts weren't so jovial about the agreement. And of course, because so many people were selling property at the same time, it drove prices down to a fraction of what they should have been worth. So the non-Mormons really got shafted in this deal. Here's an excerpt from page 99 of the Mormon War in Missouri, and it's quoting Albert P. Rockwood, who's a faithful follower of Jo and Rigdon. Quote, "The mob have now retired from Daviess County with shame and disgrace. Great, very great fear rests on the Missourians in Daviess County. They were selling their property very low to the brethren. In many cases, they sell their real estate with their houses and crops in the ground for less than the crop is worth. Daviess County is now in possession of the brethren. Real estate of the brethren has risen, while that of the Missourian has fallen 3/4 in 3 months. Thus the Lord is preparing the way for his children." End quote. Not only were the Missourians selling their property at 1/4 of the price it should be worth, but Jo and Rigdon were buying it up with church funds and selling it to Mormon refugees that were moving in at an inflated cost above what they'd purchased it for. I mean, how big can this clusterfuck get? Another massive problem this caused was setting a precedent. The Mormons agreed to buy the non-Mormons out of their property, thus making Daviess County an exclusive Mormon stronghold. Now flip that equation around, and now the Mormons are essentially obligated to agree to be bought out of their lands in counties where they don't hold the majority population. And that's exactly what happened in DeWitt, Carroll County. Before the conflict arose back in the middle of September that we just discussed in Diahmen, Dr. W. Austin's militia had been on a march towards DeWitt for the purpose of removing the Mormons from that settlement. When Dr. Austin received word of the Mormons stealing those 45 guns and taking 3 prisoners, he turned the army around and marched on Diahmen as quickly as possible, as quickly as 150 to 200 men logistically could do so. Well, Generals Doniphan and Atchison had settled this disagreement with the buyout in Daviess County, and suddenly a couple of anti-Mormon vigilante mobs didn't have anything to do but resume their original task of marching on DeWitt, back in Carroll County. By the end of September, there were about 200 Mormons living in DeWitt, who'd constructed kind of a jerry-rigged town out of wagons and tents with a few small permanent buildings. The Missourians who'd been living in DeWitt long before the Mormons had been pouring in became increasingly frustrated and hateful of the Mormons there. By September 20th, they were performing daily military drills in full view of the Mormons. And October 1st marked the first day of the actual siege of DeWitt. Now, I'm going to read a little bit from the Mormon War in Missouri on this because Stephen LeSueur does a great job of describing what happened, and I have to give full credit where it's due. He's an amazing author. Quote, "On 1st of October, a company of 150 men armed marched on DeWitt, burning the home of one Mormon family and driving out settlers along the way. Both sides began shooting when vigilante scouting parties riding near the town encountered Mormon defenders, with intermittent firing continuing for several days. During the attacks, the Mormons ranged their wagons for a breastwork and placed their women and children in a large house with a white flag flying over the roof so it would not be fired upon. The Missourians attempted a brief assault on Thursday, October 4th, but were easily repulsed by 70 to 80 Mormon soldiers. Only one person, a non-Mormon, was wounded during the skirmishing. The Missourians, reluctant to make a serious attack, sealed off the town and appealed to nearby counties for assistance." Now it's quoting a document from the actual time, quote, "This is one of the cases of emergencies in which the people ought to take the execution of justice in their own hands," Carroll citizens informed their neighbors. "We shall expect your cooperation and assistance in expelling the fanatics who are mostly aliens by birth and aliens in principle from the county. We must be enemies to the common enemies of our laws, religion, and country." Now back to quoting Stephen LeSueur. "Volunteers poured into the vigilante camp. The recent disturbances in Daviess County and the reports of continued Mormon lawlessness and rebellion had convinced many settlers that the Mormons were a criminal class of people. Some of those who had previously opposed the anti-Mormon violence now rushed to assist their neighbors. Reinforcements from Howard, Clay, Livingston, Ray, Saline, and Jackson counties swelled the forces to 400 or 500 men. The Jackson volunteers brought a cannon. Companies of men cut down and hewed timber for a battery. Others prepared cartridges, and some cut up log chains, wrought iron, and heavy nails for grape and canister for their cannon. Carroll settlers living nearby provided food and supplies for the army." End quote. I'm sorry to read such a huge excerpt from the book, but I think it perfectly captures the general tension prevailing in these counties at the time. And that last line we read is important to focus on because it plays into the larger conflict more than we can reasonably quantify. The citizens of Carroll County were providing these 500 men with food and supplies while they were drilling daily and effectively laying siege to DeWitt. The most important part of a proper siege is to cut off supply lines to the settlement which the army is sieging. So, these vigilantes, with no real government sanction, were being supplied by the outlying citizens of DeWitt and larger Carroll County, while the Mormons were ripping apart their wagons to set up defensive perimeters around town, fortifying any useful structure they could, and keeping their wives and children in a small building in the center of town, meaning that they weren't doing much to help these 70 to 80 men that were actively defending against the siege. It wasn't long before the Mormons in DeWitt were seriously starving and running low on all general supplies. Now, the Book of Mormon may have had a few times where the combating armies couldn't figure out how to siege a settlement, but the Missouri vigilante leaders were actually schooled in military tactics and strategies. This is Warfare 101, and it proved incredibly successful for the vigilante mobs. The only thing sustaining the Mormons was an occasional cow or some chickens that would wander into town, which the Mormons happily butchered for sustenance, unfortunately adding to the tension because most of this livestock was owned by the Missourians who regarded such actions as stealing. They weren't wrong, but they left the Mormons no other choice. They were starving. I mean, they'd cut off all Mormon supply lines to DeWitt, and any time a Mormon would venture outside the boundaries of the town, they were detained and arrested, some for a week or longer. Then a huge mistake happened. Jo and Rigdon, with a massive battery of reinforcements, showed up in DeWitt to try and administrate and dispel the tensions. But of course, this only invigorated the excitement of the anti-Mormons to chase him out of DeWitt to a critical tipping point. Now, General Parks showed up with 2 small brigades of soldiers comprising the Ray County militia. His entire focus was to reduce tensions, but upon arriving to DeWitt on October 6th, his troops immediately committed mutiny and joined the anti-Mormon vigilantes. And thus we see the problem of no National Guard and citizen militias playing a larger role in this escalating violence once again. Happened with General Doniphan, and now it's happening with General Parks. As soon as Jo and Rigdon arrived in DeWitt, they sent a friendly non-Mormon emissary to the office of Lilburn Boggs to plead with him in person to show up and dispel the fighting. General Parks, seeing that his troops had ignored his commands to restore order, sent his own messenger to Boggs to petition for the same request. This is a letter that General Parks sent to General Atchison, asking for his help at the time the messenger was on his way to ask Boggs for help. This is taken from the November court documents, page 37. Quote, "Should these troops from Doniphan's brigade arrive here in time, I hope to be able to prevent bloodshed. Nothing seems so much in demand here," to hear the Carroll County men talk, "as Mormon scalps. As yet they are scarce. I believe Hinkle," the Mormon military commander in DeWitt, "with his present force and position will beat Austin with 500 of his troops. The Mormons say they will die before they will be driven out, etc. As yet they have acted on the defensive as far as I can learn. It is my settled opinion the Mormons will have no rest until they leave. Whether they will or not, only time can tell." End quote. So maybe this letter kind of enlightens us to the extent the outlook had become nothing but bleak. There was no simple solution or way out of this conflict, and things had escalated to the point that the Mormons would rather die than be driven from their homes again. Can you really blame them, though? The persecution narrative was a harsh reality, and it was sold as religious. These people had been forced to move or had been violently removed from their homes by people their leaders were branding as anti-Mormon mobocrats, and they were fed up with it. By October 10th, the standing militias outside DeWitt posed an unstoppable force against the Mormon solidarity to defend DeWitt or die as an immovable object. George Hinkle, the Mormon defense commander in DeWitt, realized the situation couldn't be resolved favorably for the Mormons without massive bloodshed. A decision was made among Jo, Rigdon, and Hinkle that the surrender of DeWitt was the only possible option, or the siege would starve the town until anti-Mormon militias were merely wagering battle on walking corpses. The 10th of October marked a turning point of desperation for the Mormons. The anti-Mormon militias camped out began to mobilize for an attack, just as Hinkle sent word by way of messenger that the town of DeWitt had surrendered. Most of the next day was spent negotiating terms, but the long and short of it came to the Mormons forfeiting their weapons and property and evacuating DeWitt. To add salt to the wound, the two non-Mormons who'd initially invited the Mormons to settle in DeWitt, Henry Root and David Thomas, were also required to leave because they were Mormon sympathizers, and their hospitality contributed to this standoff arising in the first place. Rigdon and Jo made their way back to Far West immediately to continue commanding from their headquarters stronghold. As the Mormons from DeWitt flooded into the vacant homes, the Mormons negotiated from the non-Mormons who'd been chased out of Daviess County. There was still a drastic lack of resources, which was really beginning to take its toll. This is how Stephen LeSueur puts it, quote, "The Mormons, still suffering from lack of adequate provisions and shelter, left DeWitt on Thursday afternoon, October 11th. During the first night, at least one Mormon, weakened by the 2-week siege, died of exposure, and a woman named Jensen died while giving birth. Several young children would later succumb to illness contracted during the ordeal. Some DeWitt saints moved to Caldwell County, others went to Daviess. Tired, weak, and discouraged, they marched warily to their new homes. Although the Mormons later sold their town lots back to the Missourians, they were never paid for losses incurred during this siege." End quote. The Mormons were done. This was a final straw for the leadership. The rhetoric spoken by Mormon leaders after the surrender of DeWitt becomes incredible. I mean, the law had been used against the Mormons for so long, and it poisoned any trust and destroyed every bridge that still existed between the Mormons and anti-Mormons. The next few days, Rigdon and Jo rallied the troops, and in front of a crowd of 500 Mormons began saying things like this, quote, "Who is so big a fool as to cry, 'The law,' when it is always administered against us and never in our favor?" End quote. The rhetoric was responded to by the Mormon population who'd been crushed by these mobs for years by this point. My great-great-great-grandfather wrote this in a letter to his brother and sister on July 26, 1839, taken from the sketch of the life of Patience Delilah Pierce Palmer. Quote, "We have been smitten twice, yes, 3 times, and had borne it, but we said we would bear it no longer without resistance." End quote. That quote from this Mormon war book is the first quote I've seen in a Mormon history book from my own Mormon forefather. And that makes this whole thing so much more real in my mind. It was the everyday Mormon who was bearing the brunt of these larger socioeconomic struggles between groups. The anti-Mormons were fighting the Mormons, and the Mormons were fighting back and calling it defensive. Now, being the 15th of October, the Mormons were desperate, and Jo had to take offensive action out of preservation for his people. Quote, "We will take our affairs into our own hands and manage for ourselves. We have applied to the governor, and he will do nothing for us. The militia of the country we have tried, and they will do nothing. All are mob. The governor is mob. The militia are mob, and the whole state is mob. We have yielded to the mob at DeWitt, and now they are preparing to strike a blow in Daviess. But I am determined that we will not give another foot, and I care not how many come against us, 10 or 10,000. God will send his angels to our deliverance, and we can conquer 10,000 as easily as 10. End quote. First off, Jo, that's not how military tactics work, okay? if you have 500 armed men defending a makeshift city with no major walls and multiple ways in and out, they will never win a battle against 10,000. That's just not how anything works. But against 10, yes, 500 can win that battle. Second, the militias weren't going to just fight against the Mormons at the walls of Far West or Diahmen and just get shot. They were smart enough to lay siege to towns, just as they had done in DeWitt for the last 2 weeks. How long could Diahmen hold out against an army of 10,000 surrounding the city in a tactical siege? 2 weeks? A month, maybe? Tops? Winter was coming, and thousands of Mormons were going to die from either not enough food or too much exploded lead fucking ripping through their bodies. Jo decided to solve the first problem first, and deal with the second problem when it becomes inevitable. First, he had to keep the Mormons from starving. Then he would deal with the injustices the Mormons had been subjected to for so long. Jo essentially commanded the Danites through Dr. Samson Avard to ride through Daviess County and liberate the property of anyone opposed to militant Mormon action. Rigdon said any Mormon dissenters that didn't want to support the Mormon militia were known as "Oh, don't men," and that they should be strapped to horses with bayonets and put on the front lines of the Mormon offensive force. This is the command issued by Dr. Samson Avard, head of the Danites, taken from William Wines Phelps' Double Phelps Autobiographical Reminiscences, page 4, and I'm reading it from the Mormon War. Quote, "My brethren, as you have been chosen to be our leading men, our captains to rule over the last kingdom of Jesus Christ, who have been organized after the ancient order, I have called you here today to teach you and instruct you in the things that pertain to your duty, and to show you what your privileges are and what they soon will be. Know ye not, brethren, that it soon will be your privilege to take your respective companies and go out on a scout and on the borders of the settlements and take to yourselves spoils of the ungodly Gentiles. For it is written," now he quotes scripture, "The riches of the Gentiles shall be consecrated to my people, the house of Israel." Then he continues saying, "Thus waste away the Gentiles by robbing and plundering them of their property. And in this way we will build up the kingdom of God and roll forth the little stone that Daniel saw cut out of the mountain without hands, until it shall fill the whole earth. For this is the very way that God designs to build up his kingdom in the last days." End quote. Let's talk about this for a minute just to finish out the historical discussion for today. Dr. Samson Avard was one of Jo's few trusted zealots with military training. Lyman Wight was another, while George Hinkle was the commander of the mob in DeWitt before it fell. These men were capable and willing to carry out military orders under the direction of their prophet, his brother Hyrum Smith, and Hinchpin Rigdon. This order we just read, given by Samson Avard, said explicitly, "Take to yourself spoils of the ungodly Gentiles, for it is written," and then he quotes scripture. Where was it written? I mean, was that an Old Testament commandment by Yahweh to the Hebrews to kill and plunder the Amalekites or the Midianites, or maybe it was something written by the warlord Muhammad in the Quran or something? No. That was a revelation given by Joseph Smith or Sidney Rigdon to the elders assembled in Kirtland, Ohio in February of 1831, less than a year after the church had been organized, 7 years before the timeline we're discussing right now. Let's read the passage and see if it can be interpreted violently and used as justification for raiding and plundering non-Mormons, as Avard had done. This is the Doctrine and Covenants, section 44. Quote, "And this I do for the salvation of my people. And it shall come to pass that he that sinneth and repenteth not shall be cast out, and shall not receive again that which he has consecrated unto me. For it shall come to pass, that which I spake by the mouths of my prophets shall be fulfilled. For I will consecrate the riches of the Gentiles unto my people, which are of the house of Israel." End quote. If interpreted loosely, and applying the term Gentiles to any non-believer, as Mormons do, as was justifiable in this Mormon-Missouri war conflict situation, I think we have violence on American soil perpetrated at the hands of Mormons using scripture revealed 7 years previous to justify their actions. Now, this is not a new phenomenon, right? People have been committing really heinous shit using religion to justify it since we've had religion, really. I guess why I'm so appalled is the fact that the gentle, friendly Mormons you work with or are members of your family carry around this revelation in their holy books from their founding prophet, which was used to justify raiding, plundering, and eventually manslaughter against other Americans on American soil. This scripture, used to justify war against anti-Mormons, is still read today by Mormons without knowing how it was interpreted in October of 1838 to morally reconcile stealing and murder. Well, it wouldn't be Mormon scripture divinely revealed if it hasn't been changed over the years. So Mormons today actually read this from their 2013 Book of Covenants. And this I do for the salvation of my people. And it shall come to pass that he that sinneth and repenteth not shall be cast out of the church. I'm going to read these with additions emphasized. And shall not receive again that which he has consecrated unto the poor and the needy of my church, or in other words, unto me. For inasmuch as ye do it unto the least of these, ye do it unto me. For it shall come to pass that which I spake by the mouths of my prophets shall be fulfilled. For I will consecrate of the riches of those who embrace my gospel among the Gentiles unto the poor of my people who are of the house of Israel. End quote. By my count, that's 49 words that were added to a passage of 82 words originally to completely change the meaning and remove the conquest-like tone which Jo and Wight used to justify what they would do next. Pillage and burn the homes and businesses of non-Mormons in Daviess County. Marie and I took 3 episodes to get through this entire section when we read this on the My Book of Mormon podcast. But if you want to find the passage we're talking about right now, listen to the beginning of episode 122. We begin the episode with reading this very passage. Now, in listening back, I completely fucked it up both in reading the exact words and in pointing out the significance of the differences because I wasn't aware this scripture was used to justify raiding and pillaging the Gentiles when Marie and I discussed it. We talked briefly about how the 1833 version sounds militant in the sense that you must do what they're commanding, while the 2013 Book of Covenants reads more like a gentle suggestion. But had I known at the time that this scripture was used by Wight for actual militant action, I feel like Marie and I would have focused on that aspect significantly longer. Now, there will be a link for that episode of My Book of Mormon in the show notes if you want to listen to it. I'd recommend giving it a listen so you can hear us compare this huge section side by side. The differences are fucking astounding throughout the entire 93 verses, and it took us 3 one-hour episodes to burn through the whole damn thing. But, you know, I've been racking my brain about how to wrap this all together and draw some kind of greater lesson from it, you know. I'll start off with saying knowledge is power, right? Power which can be wielded in so many ways. During this timeline in our history, it's no secret that I've been heavily relying on Stephen LeSueur's book, The 1838 Mormon War in Missouri. During this episode alone, I've read several passages, and the majority of the deeper research I've done for the episode was spawned from things I'd read around what I didn't quote. This book is one of the greatest available historiographies of this time and place in American history, and so much of what I discussed here makes a great deal more sense upon reading this book alone. But one quote it contained actually blew my mind. It truly did, and if you listened to episodes 201 and 202 of The Scathing Atheist, you'll have heard this quote already, but Noah and I didn't take the precious time to reflect on the larger implications of the quote. I'll just share a small excerpt as it comes from a week further ahead in the timeline from where we stopped. The next historical episode will read the whole thing, but this is the important part, and this is from the testimony of Thomas B. Marsh, reflecting on the week of October 24th, 1838. Quote, I have heard the prophets say that he should yet tread down his enemies and walk over their dead bodies, that if he was not let alone, he would become a second Muhammad to this generation. End quote. Given the rhetoric erupting constantly from the pulpit, maybe Muhammad is an apt comparison to Joseph Smith, at least in intention, not necessarily in practice. But the more I reflect on this quote, the more I feel like I shouldn't be surprised, but it's still baffling. With the current worldview of Islam and the perceptions the blood of martyrs have effectively painted an entire world religion, it's hard to understand why somebody would willingly associate themselves with the warlord founder of Islam. People in the 1830s didn't necessarily vilify who they would call Mohammedans, but many were familiar with the history of the religion. Jo must have been in order to correctly metaphorize himself with Mo, right? Or else he never would have brought up such a despicable historical figure in the first place. Now, I decided to jump into this analogy a little bit further, and it led me to a 3-part BBC documentary titled The Life of Muhammad. You can find a link for it in the show notes if it interests you. The documentary was done quite well, with a fairly healthy mix of Muslim apologists and non-Muslim historians, so it seemed good for some cursory knowledge on the historical Mo. Within the first 13 minutes, we learn that Mo was born into poverty and given to a tribe of merchants. Jo was born into poverty and spent the majority of his time with his father and fellow treasure diggers, who were frequently taken with wild speculations on treasures and other commodities. Mo spent the first years of his life with this nomadic tribe with no place really to call home. Jo spent the earliest years of his life moving around Vermont and New York with no real sense of permanent business or purpose to direct the Smith family. Mo was born into a land of harsh life and consequences where simple survival was a bitter, everyday struggle for the majority of people. Many groups believed in many different gods, some monotheistic, most polytheistic. Muslims refer to the age before Mo's revelations, the Jahiliyyah. And I'm going to butcher a bunch of these words, but it's known as the ignorance of divine guidance. Well, Jo was born into an era of enlightenment in the burned-over district, where hundreds of people were claiming to have divine connection, preaching many different gods. But the previous era is broadly referred to as the pre-Enlightenment Dark Ages, the medieval period. Needless to say, both men were exposed to the world of religious practices, and were born in a time and place where religion was the dominant social norm, and oftentimes the central focus. The Kaaba in Mecca is known in most Islamic tradition as a sanctuary built by God in the days of Adam. Jo thought that Zion, the New Jerusalem, would be built on Independence, Missouri, because why the fuck not, right? Which just so happens to be where the Garden of Eden was, and Adam on Diahmen, or Diahmen, in Daviess County, was where Adam and Eve were exiled to after eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The Temple Lot in Jackson County is still holy ground for Mormons today, currently owned by the Hedrickites and hotly contested for during multiple times since its consecration in 1831. Mo's mother died at the age of 6, leaving him an orphan to work with another trading company. During Mo's travels, as he matured into early adulthood, he was exposed to many new people and cultures completely foreign to his limited understanding. During Jo's journey into adulthood, he was exposed to an exquisite number of preachers and pamphlets and religious zealots who were all too willing to share their views on religion, God, and reality. Thanks to the invention of the printing press, Jo had access to an immense amount more material than most of his forefather prophets had. Once Muhammad was married and had lost 2 sons, he was racked with personal turmoil concerning humankind's greatest mysteries. Why is there something rather than nothing? Where do we come from? Mo began making spiritual journeys into the mountains above Mecca, searching for spiritual enlightenment and a quiet place to meditate. Likewise, Jo, around the age of 17, frequently wandered into the wilderness on his own spiritual journeys, climbing nearby Hill Cumorah, seeking a connection that so many religious leaders and treasure hunters alike spoke of. According to Islamic tradition, one day in 610 CE, Mo was meditating, tripping, whatever you want to call it, in his favorite cave. After dozing off, he woke up to his body shaking uncontrollably, We may call it a seizure today or a swooning in Rigdon and Joe's days. But Mo supposedly described it as being enwrapped by an angel who was squeezing him so tightly that he thought his life would exit his body. Just like Joe thought he would be overcome by the adversary in the sacred grove, who seized his tongue and racked his body with torment. The voice spoke to Muhammad and commanded with one word, Ikra, which means read or dictate in some traditions. Mo replied he's not learned and he can't read. The spirit returned, commanding him the same thing a second time, and Mo again said that I'm not one of those who can read. For the third time in a row, the angel Gabriel returned to Muhammad and revealed this through him. Quote, proclaim, or read, in the name of thy Lord and Cherisher, who created man out of a clot of congealed blood. Proclaim, and thy Lord is most bountiful, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. End quote. That is from the Quran, Surah 96, verse 1 through 5. Now, according to his own earliest account, Joe was meditating and praying all night, only to be visited by an angel later reported as Nephi and changed to Moroni. Joe was visited 3 times that night, with the promise that he would read and translate an ancient text written by prophets of old on the new continent. From that point on, Muhammad would go on to be a politician and a warlord, using his revelations as the proof that Allah had chosen him as the last true prophet, committing genocide, trading slaves, marrying multiple women, one of which was 9 years old. From the time Joe revealed the Book of Mormon, he would go on to be a religious leader and local political powerhouse, commanding his will to be done, claiming it was the wisdom or will of the one true Lord. Eventually, we see Joe waging war on the Missourians, and being subsequently jailed for doing so, only to escape and end up running for President of the United States 5 years later. While Joe and Mo may not exactly be two balls in a sack, it's hard to ignore some underlying themes here, right? Joe called himself a second Muhammad. I doubt he realized just how deep those similarities ran, but I only really care to focus on one. Both of these men were seekers for truth, and used the tools at their disposal to strive for it. I don't see what we do today to be any different. We just have different tools at our disposal. And going down this rabbit hole of historical Muhammad, I wandered over to the Islam subreddit. Oddly, one of the least popular subreddits I've ever seen. A link that was posted up took me to a daily hadith online, where they post up random scriptures from the Quran or the hadiths every day. The one it showed me when I navigated was amazing, and fit perfectly into a larger point I'm somehow wandering towards right now. This is the scripture from the Hadith Sahih al-Bukhari, 3261, quote, do not exaggerate my praises as the Christians have done with the Son of Mary. Verily, I am only a servant, so refer to me as the servant of Allah and his messenger, end quote. I love that line coming from somebody claiming to be the spokesperson for Almighty God. Do not exaggerate my praises. Are you kidding me? For all the time and effort we as humans collectively invest into people we think have some kind of divine connection, it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that they're all just people. That oneness and connection these people supposedly felt or claimed to be evidence for the divine can be easily attained by anyone through quiet alone time, exhaustion, entheogens, fasting, thirst, sleep deprivation, or really spiritual Kama Sutra experience, or any number of common meditation techniques. I suppose I would just wonder, do these people living hundreds or thousands of years ago know more about reality than we do today? Did they have better tools for understanding the world around them than we do today? A follow-up and possibly more important question: do these people that we call prophets have access to something that you or I don't? When I look back on Joe and Mo, all I see were dudes trying to make sense of the world around them. Eventually, they got in over their heads, and one rose to prominence as a warlord, and the other was jailed and lost a gunfight before he could actually wage war on American soil. But these men went through crazy situations they often got themselves into, And they were just dudes dealing with the everyday insanity their previous decisions had led them to. These guys were never the bad guys in their own mind. They were the protagonists to their own stories. They were their own heroes. They heard or saw, felt, or just experienced things that we can all experience. They just didn't have the scientific method to rein in the bullshit they'd spew while high on spirits. Occam's razor is far too precise of a tool to be properly wielded by a truth-seeking warlord in the 6th century or a truth-seeking treasure digger born at the dawn of the 19th century. Given everything that happened with these men, there's simply no way they were divinely inspired. They were so clearly just a couple of guys flying by the seat of their pants, making reactive decisions after coming up with their credibility-establishing books, which were supposedly given to them after they had some kind of spiritual experience. This shit happens all over the world, every single day. We just have the internet now and lightning-fast communication, so we can see it happening on a much larger scale than these two men ever could have experienced or conceived of. Now, one of my favorite metal bands is called Aversion's Crown. The lyrics they generate are completely astonishing in their poetic acumen. From reading their lyrics, they sincerely believe that every world religion is all bullshit and that the human race was spawned from a super race of aliens living on the 9th planet that will come back to harvest our biology and extract the contained energy. It's a relentlessly stupid proposition, but it comes from an entire subculture that exists online of people who believe the same thing, regardless of evidence. People who consider Ancient Aliens to be a documentary TV show. They're all searching for a connection to something greater than the human life itself. Arguably, Jo and Mo were doing the same thing. But why should we listen to any of them? Fascination is a simple, yet incomplete answer. I love the music that band makes, and I love religious history, but just because I'm studying it doesn't mean I buy any of this bullshit. I suppose the overall point is that these examples show us that people will always search for something greater than themselves, as if somehow the whole of their biology is made up from more than the sum of their parts. On my way back to Seattle from the holidays, I had a lovely in-flight discussion with a Muslim woman sitting next to me. I'd just done this little bit of cursory searching to learn about the historical Muhammad, and of course I've been listening to the last year of the Scathing Atheist when they've been reading and lampooning the Quran. Quranomaniacs, please listen to those segments, it's fantastic. So in engaging in a discussion with this Muslim woman, I felt a bit more comfortable talking about her religion and world politics than I expected that I would. But our conversation continued off the flight, and finally ended when we had to part ways at the exit of the airport. I doubt she'd had much exposure to atheism. She didn't get off much of a Muslim apologist tone, so the conversation wasn't an argument, just a pleasant exchange of ideas. The one thing I left her with, and it's a very typical atheist trope, I can't even remember where I first heard it, but I said that billions of people have believed in millions of gods as long as humans have been tracking culture through written language. The earliest writings we have are land deeds and religious inscriptions on tablets or cave walls. You don't worship any of those millions of gods, nor do I. That means you're an atheist about 99.9% of all gods that have ever existed. I'm just an atheist about one more god than you. And I think that got to the central point of our meandering discussion. It doesn't matter what Jo, Mo, or Aversion's Crown claim to be God. All that matters is we learn what they have to say and judge the merits of their claims based on demonstrable evidence. Really just a long way of saying, skepticize everything. And that is it for the historical portion of today's episode. Looks like we have a few new patrons we need to thank here. It's been a little while since we've caught up on this, so looks like first off we have new Nemo Juvenile Delinquents, Lisa, my good friend David Stout, thanks. Betty and Steven, thank you all very much. And then, of course, we have, looks like 2 new NAMO Adolescent Rebels, Shane and Vance. Thank you so much to all of you who fund the show at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Of course, without you, I would not be able to take all of the time to research and compile this together. That is what you are funding, is research and investigative journalism. So to everybody who does support, all of the patrons as well as the new listeners who've signed up, thank you all very, very much. Your generosity is deeply appreciated. This episode has essentially gone on long enough, so we will do listener mail segment next week and take a bit of time to go through a little bit of the backlog of emails that have been building up for a little while here. But I do want to address quickly a Facebook post here. And it's in relation to what we've discussed for the past couple of episodes of Joseph Smith's possible entheogen use in order to incite visionary hallucinations in his followers. And, of course, I posted up on the Mormon Historians Facebook group the post about this topic, and it unfortunately didn't really go anywhere. A couple of people interacted with it, but really I was surprised at how many people seemed to just completely ignore it. I'm going to read the correspondence that came out of it really quickly. So this is what the 2 people said that engaged with the post of the episodes in this Mormon Historians Facebook group. We have Troy, who said, "This theory isn't reasonable. There are 1,000 better explanations that make more sense between angels visiting the congregation or every congregant was slipped a Mickey that caused them all to have an experience that was precisely corroborated in every way. Go visit any Pentecostal church for insight into what happened in Kirtland." And then Brent Metcalf, who was a name that came up in the Mark Hoffman episodes, replied with a carrot pointing to Troy's comment, "Exactly. We need to abandon trying to explain Joseph Smith at all in terms of how we, moderns, would replicate the experiences of a culture far removed from our post-critical worldview. That type of presentism depletes our understanding of early 19th century visionaries." And then I went about replying with 4 paragraphs and a snapshot that was sent over thanks to a listener, Vanishing Man. And we'll discuss that in the next listener mail segment, of course. But so this was essentially my reply. I'm going to read through it here pretty quickly. "I suppose where I land on the subject is naturalistic explanations for multiple people seeing visions. It makes sense that a Pentecostal-like revival was what they were experiencing, but it also seems that corroborated may be the incorrect term when describing the visions experienced. Some people saw angels, others claimed to have seen God walking up the pews or sitting next to Joseph on the stand. Others heard a whooshing noise. Combining these different experiences and hearing from people like William E. McClellan and others that there were copious amounts of wine consumed by most, it's not hard to conclude that there may have been something special about the wine, or the anointing oil for that matter. A combination of spiritual entheogens along with a Pentecostal revival seems like it would yield much more reliable results that Joseph would have been seeking for his parishioners. Brent, you said it well. It's hard for us to put our minds where theirs were in the early 19th century. I'm of the opinion that Joseph was an adept conman who would use props for his cons to ensure their effectiveness. Stone in the hat, plates in the box, dove landing on his shoulder and eating the grain out of his ear, etc. A listener recently sent over this picture of his grandmother's opium tincture recipe from 1870s. It was very typical of the day to send the listener's 12-year-old mother to the local emporium to pick up the opium for the recipe. The taboos we understand of opiate or any other combined tincture medicines today are, as stated, a post-critical worldview. And in parentheses I have, I'm afraid I don't really understand the meaning of this, so hopefully I used it correctly. We have a perspective of these chemicals being drugs, needing a war to curtail their use, but that's a late 20th century construct. We simply can't understand what people like Joseph et al. Would have thought about these drugs, or how much they were a part of their everyday lives. If this theory provides explanatory power, should we really, quote, abandon trying to explain it, end quote? If there really are 1,000 better explanations for what we see in the School of the Elders and the Kirtland dedication ceremony, what are they, and do they hold more explanatory power than the use of hallucinogens and a programmed trip, as Cody stated in the second part of our discussion? And then I posted a screenshot of the Vanishing Man's grandmother's opium tincture recipe. And nothing came of it. Unfortunately, nothing spawned out of that comment, and I'm really hoping to get more correspondence on it, but it seems as if the conversation thread has gone completely dead now, unfortunately. But oh well, such is the nature of this field of historical study. But it seems like something worth addressing. And that's the reason why I invited Cody on to hash out this information, because it's so confusing to me. And I'm looking for alternate perspectives, alternate theories that explain this. Now, thanks to James Van Heel, who posted on the Naked Mormonism Facebook page, there's something that, kind of spiked my curiosity. It's a mind-blowing phenomenon that I think I am part of it as well. And let me just read James' post here. It says, Bryce, this is an interesting article about a social phenomenon called contagion of memory, which I've heard referred to before, but I've never seen concrete examples of it. He goes on to say, I originally saw it in relation to the concept of how Christ rumors could have spread around Galilee and emanated wildly. In fact, I think this works on so many levels in religious groups, particularly in constructing post hoc rationalizations and justifications, such as Brigham assuming the mantle of Joseph in Nauvoo after his martyrdom, which is multiply attested that Brigham Young basically became Joseph Smith, but it's all after it happened. James goes on to say, however, I have to say that it actually made me think of the Spalding proposition, trying to avoid non-scientific use of theory. Something in this rings such a bell in many people coming forward, recounting similar memories of something there is no record for. I would imagine the effect to be stronger, being that they knew the manuscript existed, albeit unrecovered. And then he posted a link, and the link is to theearthchild.co.za. And the title of it is Glitch in the Matrix. Many people claim to have seen a movie that never existed. So I couldn't help but follow the link because it seems somewhat interesting. People claiming that to see a movie that didn't exist. And there's a picture of Sinbad on there. And it says, this is from the top of the article on theearthchild.co.za. There's a link for it in the show notes. This is one of the strangest internet stories you will likely ever read. There are people on Reddit and Twitter attempting to find a movie called Shazam, which starred actor and comedian Sinbad as a friendly genie. According to those who have claimed to have seen this movie, it came out before Shaq's critically panned comedy called Kazam, and was a relatively enjoyable 90s comedy. The only problem is, there's no record of such a movie ever existing, and Sinbad himself says he never acted in it or even heard of it before random people on the internet started asking him about it. The magazine New Statesman has just published a fascinating investigative article about the conspiracy, and some theories as to why so many people have vivid memories of watching a movie that there's no evidence has ever existed. Literally, there are no records of the movie ever being made. No photos, no old VHS tapes, nothing. That's despite cash rewards from people eager to prove it is real. It's like, what? A Sinbad movie as a genie? I mean, that sounds kind of familiar. I mean, I was a young kid in the 90s when this would have come out, but it seems kind of familiar. So I decided to jump into this a little bit further and jumped onto Snopes.com to try and see, can I affirm this story, or is it a nope story? Let's find out here. So you quickly Google Sinbad in the search bar for Snopes.com and see what they have to say. And up comes the article, Did Sinbad Play a Genie in the 1990s movie Shazam? And it's fact check. All right, so here we go. This is the article. While many people claim to clearly recall comedian Sinbad's playing a genie in a movie called Shazam, those memories appear to be yet another example of the Mandela effect. Now, to let people know, the Mandela effect is where a group of people thought that they heard of Nelson Mandela being killed in prison in the early 90s before he was released in 93, but then they heard that he died in 2013. They're like, I thought Nelson Mandela had died, and many people had the false memory of Mandela having died. So this Snopes article, of course, shows that it takes everything apart, why people think that the Sinbad acted in this movie. There was even a picture posted up on Reddit of a VHS tape that is the cover of Sinbad in Shazam. It looks exactly like what you would expect it to look like. But of course, Snopes being Snoped tracked it down and found out, it's very clearly a Photoshop. It showed the original picture that was taken for Sinbad's body and shows how it was altered and made to look like this VHS cover. So, somebody was claiming that they had found a VHS tape and posted up a picture of it. It was just Photoshopped. It was a doctored photo. So the thing is this Shazam movie never happened from all that we can tell. But many people, and maybe even some of you, have a memory, as I do, of watching a movie that had Sinbad as a magical genie. I don't know, it must be a conflation of movies that I saw, of a couple of different movies. It must be a false memory because there's simply no evidence that this movie ever existed. So, this is the most incredible thing. It made me think back to this discussion that we've been having of Joseph possibly drugging his parishioners, and when you look on it through this lens of people having the Mandela effect, most of those people recording that they saw an angel or whatever was recorded long after it happened, sometimes years, decades. I don't think any accounts that we have access to were written the actual day that the Kirtland temple dedication ceremony happened. Were the Mormons experiencing a Mandela effect? A complete false memory that their brain just fabricated? Who knows, right? This is a different theory, and it possibly has explanatory power above and beyond the hallucinogen or the entheogen theory that Joseph Smith was drugging his parishioners. Or maybe it plays a part into it. Maybe both of them are accurate, right? And maybe this is just this helps to formulate the memories that these people recounted, but the hallucinogens got them to the point that they would have experiences where they could reflect upon and say that I saw spirits, I hallucinated things. Who knows? This is such a fascinating rabbit hole to dive down. But I find it amazing that nobody in the Mormon Historians Facebook group posted up anything about this. But thanks to James Van Heel posting this on the Naked Mormonism Facebook page, it provides context for me. It provides an alternate explanation or a possible additional explanation for why these people saw what they claim they saw. So I wanted to thank James on the air for sending me down this rabbit hole of research about this Shazam movie and, thinking about the possible larger implication of this same effect on Mormon history, on what I'm reading here, of these multiple first-hand accounts not actually being as reliable as we thought. So, James, thank you for posting that up, and, for anybody that it did, and for all of the people that did engage in this discussion about hallucinogens and Joseph's use of them. Thank you all very much. It's been an enlightening and exciting conversation, and I've been thoroughly enjoying it. That being said, we need to close out the episode, but before we jump into thanking everybody, as I need to do, I did want to tell everybody I was recently on an episode of the Podunk Polymath podcast, the Po, I think as Chris Watson calls it, and we dove into talking about politics. I try and keep this show apolitical, and talk about the politics that were going on at the time that affected Joseph Smith and his people, but I try and stay as far separated from current politics as possible. Maybe this is a sanctuary for those of you that do engage in listening to those kind of podcasts and want to get away to something new. So that's what Chris and I discussed on the Podunk Polymath, the current sphere of politics, and I just have to say I had a really good time talking to him. And he's a smart guy. He's read many more books than I have on much broader topics, so it's really fun to talk to Chris, and I look forward to meeting him at ReasonCon 2017 in April. So of course, if you do want to hear some of my ideas on the current sphere of politics, that will be in the show notes for the Podunk Polymath podcast, titled Naked Politics, episode 21, I believe. But of course, that is the final announcement for today, and I do need to thank a few people before shutting it down for the evening. First off, I want to thank Demonista for administrating the Facebook page. She does a really good job doing that. I want to thank Jason Camo for providing the music that's used in this show with his permission. You can go to A Lost State of Mind to download his music there, and please donate to the man. He's providing amazing work. Also want to thank Craig Keeling for the artwork that's used in this show. For his blog, you can go to weirdmormonshit.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can do through one-time donations on nakedmormonismpodcast.com or through patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Thanks to all of those who do support it. If you want to leave a voicemail talking about your story or something that was discussed in the podcast or make corrections, you can at 864-NAKED-MO, 864-625-3366. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of the amazing listeners for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Just $5 an episode away from Namo Home Evenings. The preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.